Why, of course they would. He zooms in on it. It can film the whole camera. But do you think it, can he get it, or?
No, I get it.
Okay. Charles, I think we're zooming right in now on a photograph taken of you at about the time you were in the loft on 40th Street. I guess you were about
earlier in Chicago.
Oh, but this is earlier from Chicago. You're about 22 then.
Maybe 21.
21, and you designed the picture and took it yourself?
Yes, that's true. I pressed the bulb.
It's quite an innovative background. Is that tin foil and gauze?
It was made out of that lead foil in which photographic plates were wrapped.
It's a very arresting shot of you. And it was about this time, I guess, down on the loft on 40th Street that Kitty Miller used to come down.
I had a little white makeup on.
Very Chinese. But it was about this time that I guess that Kitty Miller would come down to the 40th Street loft. In fact, I think you mentioned a little earlier
that she was one of very many people.
And I think didn't she come up to you and remember kind of a funny incident last year at the Metropolitan Museum?
She said, "You are the one who pressed the felt hat right on my head and burnt my hair off," which I think was an exaggeration. But when I think of the clients of that time, they were very much more interesting, perhaps because I was young.
But some of them
But nevertheless, their names are still important, like Jean Eagles was a client. Now, you know who I mean?
Of course.
How many people seeing this will know?
Well, why don't we tell them?
Well, I'm asking you, what do you think? It's an important point.
I never underestimate any of you, and so I'm sure that a lot of you know who Jean Ingalls was, and who Kitty Miller is, and who Babe Paley was, and...
Babe Paley was much later.
Well, some of the clients that you did back on the 40th Street loft would still be around. Now, Kitty Miller's still around.
No, the one who was the first important client was Mrs. Oliver Bird Jennings. That's, Burr is the same thing as Aaron Burr, you know, it's way back.
As you are.
And
deep into American history.
They were cousins of the Brewsters. It's a very old family, too. And the Jennings family had become partners, or Mr. Jennings Sr. had become a partner, of Rockefeller very early. And he'd made a considerable fortune and built a big house on Long Island called Burwood. His son lived in Paris and married Isa de Rivas from Ecuador. They separated, it's true, not very long afterwards, but remained friends. And it was her apartment in which I found Elsa Peretti living.
When you went for dinner?
Yeah.
Last year?
Yes. And to my horror, I found that Holston had perpetrated his existence in the same apartment earlier.
That's true.
But my clothes had lived in, the clothes I made for Mr. Jennings, had lived there over the course of 25 years.
In fact, you were so upset, I believe you walked in and you walked out.
Yeah, exactly. And the next day, 6 pots of lilies arrived from Elsa Peretti.
Whose picture's right here. I don't know if we can...
Yeah, just... Why don't I
take it off? In fact, Elsa Peretti is, I guess, one of the lucky women, one of, I guess, what is it now, 3 that can actually say...
I'm very lucky to have her interests, because everything which could be said to be in her interest is jeopardized by her becoming my client, and particularly ordering copies of the clothes I made for Mrs. Jennings as early as 1929.
Well, I think there are a lot of the clothes that you made in 1929 that are being produced today, not
Which
necessarily under your own name,
is,
but are selling as new and innovative
yes,
designs.
as Mr. Holston's bicentennial dress.
I remember that well.
I think it was a gesture of gallantry and courage for Elsa to come to me.
And she's ordered, I think we talked recently about the diaphanous blouse,
Yeah, she's
like a
left
butterfly,
it
and
sort
she's...
of up to me to make what I can. And I think she's a much nicer person than people think. And she's had a very hard time getting where she has got.
Well, you've
It's
known her for a
very
long
great
time.
competition. But I knew her as a model at Holston.
And you knew her, in fact, when she came down to the Chelsea here and saw some of your jewelry models. In fact, I
Yes,
think she
that's
mentioned at
right.
the time that she was quite inspired by it.
Yeah.
And it was even then, I think, that perhaps her beginning her interest in jewelry and sculpture.
She wanted to
started to
study
evolve.
with me. But she's probably pressed from all sides too much, you know, in her present job. That's what happens to successful people in America. They're squeezed dry.
Do you think you've been squeezed dry then,
I
Charles?
would have been if I'd remained in connection with 7th Avenue.
But instead, you're still bursting with ideas and...
Yes.
And I think, indeed, the energy to carry them out. And the question arises as we talk about the past and the present. What about the future, Charles? Would you like to continue to
well,
not
I
just
would,
design, but
I
to see your
must
designs
say,
worn by American women?
at 71 years old, the number of years during which I can be enthusiastic about personalities is limited. I've known personalities. I tend not to compare favorably those who are past office personalities today with those whom I have known. I think the people I knew had a tougher time becoming a personality.
Such as, say, Gypsy Rose Lee, who was a great
Oh,
friend
she
and
had a
client.
very tough time. But I mean, even if you go back to Mae Marsh or something like that, all those people had to work very hard to be personalities. Today, a press agent or two, you know, makes a personality overnight.
And you certainly knew the hard-working stars of yesteryear, Claudette Colbert, Mae Marsh.
I never knew Claudette Colbert, but I did know Mary Garden, of course, who was America's great contribution to opera.
In fact, didn't
She
you,
was Scottish, really.
you once said that dressing opera stars was perhaps your favorite.
Yes, that was an involvement. My mother sang very well, and she went to the same school as Mary Garden. And it was run by Mrs. Duff in Chicago, who used to take the students to Europe every year. And there's a very funny story about Mrs. Duff. One day at breakfast, something went wrong, and she said to the student, "You never had a voice at all. I don't know why you're here." She'd been paying for the whole class for a long time and was dismissed that way. I think the egg was cold. It was something very silly. But Mary Garden, after she'd sung too strenuously, lost her voice and had very bad criticisms. And she returned in around 45 years old to Mrs. Duff, who was in her 80s, and retrained. And the only recordings of Mary Garden, which she approved, since she had the matrices destroyed of her earlier recordings, were those made when she was over 50.
Why did she have the recordings destroyed?
She didn't think they were up to standard. She told me she could not sing to a trumpet. In those days, that's how recording was done.
They didn't have the entire orchestra? They just had the
No,
trumpet?
no, trumpet and three-piece orchestra or something.
I didn't know that at all.
But she wasn't satisfied with that. But Mary Garden did bring a whole new format of opera singing into the world. She did introduce acting. People sometimes said that she acted better than she sang. That's not true. Nobody ever made a great reputation singing without a voice. It could be small. Mary Gardens was not really small. Bidu Sayo had a small voice.
Sometimes when they seem to get older, the dramatic part becomes more important to them.
Perhaps, yes. But Bidu Sayo was able to sing to the Lewisham Stadium and be heard at the back seat with a small voice. It's all projection.
And the acoustics.
Yeah, and early training.
Well, tell us a little bit about Mae Marsh then. How did you kind of know her?
She wasn't a very glamorous person like Mary Garden. Mary Garden was taken in lots of ways. The perfume house, Rigaud, got her to sign a contract as a train left. And later she found she had no compensation. And the perfume was all over the place, Mary Garden, in a red satin covered box. And it's very interesting to know that Mrs. Vreeland's husband became head of that company. And when I wrote to him about it at the time that Mary Garden was 91 and incapacitated, I had no answer. But then I had no answer from Mrs. Kennedy either, who was a patron of the arts and music. Should certainly have answered me. I had met her before.
Are you speaking of the present Mrs. Onassis?
Yes, oh, I can't bother with all these changed names. But I asked her to head a committee to pay a tribute to Mary Garden. Not money. She didn't need money. The British provide for their artists. But she needed attention. And she was, I think, 91. She'd broken both arms and was hospitalized. She'd taken to drink at 89. She was a teetotaler all her life. And she had sung from the bed in hospital early Scotch songs, perfectly beautifully. She'd not lost her middle register, and that's usually what singers lose first. Yeah, and Mrs. Onassis chose to disregard my letter. But I invented the committee. Had I known you then, I would have put you on it, even if I didn't ask you.
I would gladly gone on it.
Certain people on it who would have also liked, but whom I didn't, to be on it, but whom I didn't see very often. And I sent a congratulatory telegram, cable to Mary Garden on her 90th birthday it was. And she had her doctor answer me that she sent warm wishes and appreciation to her American audience.
Isn't that grand?
I think so.
That was a wonderful thing to do, Charles.
But it was normal. You see, she'd been my pin-up girl at school at Lake Placid.
A fan to the end, you were.
Yes, well, I mean, her pictures made her look, of course, younger than she was. But she was very striking. She was the best Thais of all, and I think you've got the recording.
Yes, I have, Beverly Sills.
Yeah, and Beverly Sills may be the second best.
She has a beautiful voice, Beverly Sills.
Absolutely incredible, and so unlike her talking voice, her speaking voice, I think. Mary
Thank
Garden,
God.
too, had a low speaking voice. It seems very curious that singers have one voice to speak in and one to sing in, and that they're quite different.
Much the way actors are different on stage and off.
Yes, but do you think there's a difference in the voice?
I think sometimes there is.
I had a lot to do with the theatre in London, you know, but not here because I had to pass the union test about historical costume. And I didn't really care to know what the Plantagenets wore. Had nothing to do with what I was making because I was going forward.
But it
I
didn't,
was giving, I wasn't taking. And the American custom of deriving everything claimed as new from something old was an antithesis to my way of thought.
and of course that's still going on today.
And the whole Paris Couture thought the way I did. Everybody was judged as to their contribution.
Well, you were one of the, I think, the only American that was ever welcomed within the same breath mentioned with the Paris Couture. It was Balenciaga and Madame Gray, Chanel, Dior, and Charles James. I mean, the Dictionary to Snobism lists you, I think, as what? Dior said that you were one of the top
No.
three?
Philippe Julien said I was the head of it.
That's correct. But even
And
Dior
Dior
acknowledged...
said I was one of the three in America. And Sir Francis Rose quotes him as saying that I invented the new look.
From a remark
Yeah.
that you had said.
Yeah. And he's the first to mention my work in terms of sculpture. And also to point out how much I like perfume. I once had Guerlain make up the entire catalog of everything they've made since they opened for an Indian. Cost a great deal. But one could smell the past.
It's a shame.
In reading Balzac, you could know how various heroines smelled. And Balzac wrote the novel about Mr. Guerlain, which was turned into a film, which is called The Rise and Fall of Caesar Birotteau. That was Mr. Guerlain.
I didn't know that.
No, very few people do know
Abbey
that.
Rouge is, of course, a Guerlain scent, my favorite I've used for...
I like the ones that discontinued because they've fallen into the American trap of narrowing their sales, limiting them to, say, 3 or 4 perfumes, while the firm of Guerlain was noted for being quite willing to make anything over again which they had ever made at all.
Like a kitchen of haute cuisine.
Yes, exactly. And they had a soap, a box, let's describe it. It's like a chest of drawers with little metal boxes in it. And they had all the soaps they'd ever made in them. And you see this pride of how they come to be the top firm of the world has been attacked really by the American department stores who want to have only 3 perfumes and the radio talking about 3 perfumes, you see.
And of course, you at one time put together the ingredients for the Charles James perfume, didn't you?
Yes, I did, but it didn't get off the ground.
What happened to that, Charles?
Well, I had nobody to back it.
Did you go to Grasse and pick out the...
No, I went
petals?
to Dupont Roux here and Angmering. Lily Angmering is Lily Auchincloss. But I felt that the oils here smelled a little bit like gas escaping. And I never did like any American perfume that I remember, excepting occasionally a very cheap one.
Did you have a small private batch of your scent made up? Did anyone get to
No.
wear it?
No, I only had samples. I didn't want to start in a small way.
What do you think of the current perfumes?
I think they
A
all
lot of
smell
it-
alike.
A lot of, I think, 7th Avenue now is really rushing into the perfume field. All the designers seem to have a perfume now.
Well, all the designers are emulating the couturier.
And of course, the couturiers always
had a
never,
great influence on perfume.
well, it's because they never made a penny off the couture. It costs money to dress
It wasn't
ladies
only
in
the
couture.
money, it was that they were involved in perfume.
Well, isn't it because that's where they made all their profits?
No, that wouldn't be the reason for an involvement. It might result from one.
Ah, but their reason was more aesthetic.
Yes, it was perfume turned them on.
But in the end, the result was that the perfume supported the house.
Yes, and many other things. I had 7 or 8 things before the lawsuit brought at Eleanor Lambert's instigation by one of her clients, who was a licensee. And as a result of winning the case, all stopped paying their royalties. So I lost $75,000 a year guaranteed on paper by winning a case brought against me.
Well, the case really was the mark of your ruin, I think, financially.
Yes, it was, but then that was a very stupid thing because I had given to the market so much that life said that even Paris acknowledged my contribution to fashion.
Oh, Europe has acknowledged your contribution far more, I think, than America has.
America has used it more widely.
And they still are using it.
Yeah. And unmercifully.
How do you feel about the plagiarists that are ripping off your designs, copying your necklines, indeed your old patterns that you did in the 20s, and representing today and calling it new, calling it their own?
Well, I feel above all disgusted, secondly furious, and thirdly sorry for them.
Why sorry?
Because they've invented reputations through public relations which can't stand up after advertising and public relations money is withdrawn.
Don't you think that now there's a dangerous melting of art and the business conglomeration? The business conglomerations, you know, giving the money to the museums, who indeed may be turning to some of the amateurs.
They
and
are.
bestowing upon them the blessing of the museum in setting up a standard that is not as high as the museum would have the public believe.
That's absolutely true.
You say it.
The
far better than I
museums
do.
are sold out for chicken feed.
It seems to be happening, doesn't it?
They haven't really made any money that way. Don't think Mrs. Vreeland has made money for the Met. She's been allowed to spend. She's justified the expenditure of a lot of money.
Well, I mean, I think if we're going to deal with the Metropolitan Museum, Mrs. Vreeland, we should talk about it. She is a woman who knows your career well. She was of your era.
No, you know she doesn't.
Well, she certainly
She
knows who you
knows
are,
that
Charles.
people whom she admires, being a terrific snob, do think well of me. So she can't then think ill of me.
No, she doesn't. She told me so herself.
But
that
she
respects
has
you highly.
never missed an occasion to damage my work, to rub out publicity that I was entitled to.
Why do you think that is? Look at the last show.
Oh, I
about...
think it's because she wants the world to think that her decision is the decision of God.
Well, she's wrong.
Well, she proved to be wrong. And she has been proven wrong in the incident of the white satin coat.
Which the Victorian Albert bought.
Yes, for the highest price ever paid. And which she thought wasn't good enough for her show.
Well, her last show on the innovative
Yes, she left me
clothes
out
of the
that.
40s. I asked her about that, and she said, "Oh, he doesn't fit in there." But
Well, I mean, my life has been one of innovation. That's pretty well known.
well, of course, the Metropolitan Museum has many of your dresses, Charles.
Yes.
As does the Smithsonian, and does the Brooklyn Museum,
and 34 museums in
around
all.
the world, exactly.
So, above all, Mrs. Vreeland is the queen of perversity. Her idea of wit is to say something perverse.
And so, in other words, to leave you out and to put you down is somehow perversely witty in her own mind?
Yes, somehow or other.
I think she's just waiting for you to die so she can do what she wants.
But I think that could be true, too. I do know that I was forbidden a reproduction of a catalog put out by Miss Lewison, who founded the Lewison Library, which is the square root of the Costume Institute. And I can't understand why, excepting that it was a Paris couture show, and I had several pieces in it, ranking with the Paris houses. And Mrs. Vreeland had said that I really hadn't worked out of Paris.
Well, Charles.
I think to you, indeed. And later, any proof that I had worked out of Paris would put her in the wrong.
Well, Charles, I remember well when you decided, I remember you telling me, was it 38, that you took the couture collection over to Paris and showed it at the Plaza Athénée?
47.
It was 40, that's exactly right. It was 47 that you took your entire collection and set up a midnight candlelight show
with harps.
With harps at the Plaza Athénée.
And Mr. Berard, the host, with the Comte Etienne de Beaumont.
And all business people, band.
Yes.
It was just society and, of course, the press.
But you see, the war had come and gone. But before the war, I was known as a Paris couturier. I'd left London 4 years before that.
And this was
But
after you left
even
New York.
then, I used to go yearly to Paris, or bi-yearly, to show my collection and sell original models. Nobody from America has ever shown original models with any success. Elizabeth Hawes did, but they weren't very original.
How did you decide to go to Paris? Or I guess it was just a natural evolution.
Well, my family always went to Paris, and you know Henry James said that all good Americans die in Paris. And it was a tradition in my family to buy clothes at a good house in Paris, which dated back to '86. Before then, they had good clothes in America, but from French dressmakers who emigrated. There were a great many, you know. There was wonderful custom dressmaking in America. But they usually were not very creative, but they were beautifully made. My grandmother's wedding dress, made in St. Louis in '73, was more beautifully made than anything you could find today.
Tell me, Charles, how many years did you show the clothes in Paris?
Well, between the years when I lived in London but showed in Paris, and the years when I lived in Paris and showed them there too, I imagine about 8.
And were you very successful there? Did you have a large
Yes, I didn't
clientele
have
in
big
Paris?
sales, but I had sales to all the big houses, the Bergdorf Goodmans, right down to the Macy's. And my private clientele was very distinguished. And they were the French women who were often given their dresses without charge by the big houses.
But they paid for a Charles
They
James
paid
dress,
to
didn't
me, yeah. And French, you know, do that to women usually who have money. They don't want to be known as dressing women who don't have any money. Because while I don't like to dwell on the importance of money, it does make social life more possible.
Well, I think even now you have to think about money, Charles. You're forced with the problem of paying the rent, paying the telephone. In fact, it's true that you're considering going on welfare, isn't it?
Yes, it is, in order to
that
get my
shocking?
doctor's bills
It's
paid.
just the most shocking, ridiculous thing. I mean, it's unimaginable that the
But
government doesn't come and rescue you. It's
It's
a tragedy.
unimaginable that a coat made in '38 could command $6,000, and I should have to go on welfare to get my doctor's bills paid. But the reason for that is simple. I never paid Social Security in for myself. I paid it for my workers. So I was left out. I couldn't qualify for Social Security and medical aid, but I could only do that if I went on welfare.
Well, Charles, I think you should go on welfare. You know, I pay a lot of money in taxes, and if my taxes are going to give you the money to pay the doctors, then that's the way I want it
The
spent.
money people pay in taxes has nothing at all to do with the amount the government spends. That's an old story. Government spends what it wishes. It prints its own money. The trouble is that our exports are going down and our imports are going up. So the balance of trade has, for the 12th or 13th month, been unfavorable. Therefore, our gold is being depleted. But when that situation didn't exist, we were able to print as much money as we want because we had the gold to support it.
Well, I can see you're keeping right up on the latest political scene, Charles. That's good. You still have an interest then in the outside world. You haven't closeted yourself up in your rooms in the Chelsea, living in the past.
No, but one was brought up at school to read those things. At a time one thought they were dull. But I discovered on my own Maynard Keynes' book on the Versailles Treaty and how he said that it would cause another war because to bolster the English sagging business, we were getting reparations out of Germany which prevented them buying raw materials, which in turn forced them to take the Sudetenland. But contrary to what papers printed, many people liked that because they had a bigger market. See, when they took Vienna, people went to church and thanked God. We heard that it was the other way around. But at that time, Germany hadn't become a harassed, distressed state given to excesses of every sort, which I might say are only bigger than those in the Civil War here because more people were involved. Civil War shows an exhibition of more cruelty than any other war known. The mortality was greater.
Would you like to lead the Civil War on 7th Avenue in American fashion today? Would you like to pick up the banner and encourage all the young students, people who perhaps still have high ideals and aspire to...